I was going to do a reading, but I think we'll skip that because you know the Easter story from the New Testament, or the Christian Testament as we tend to call it. And just remember that that story has many different versions to it because it relied on the memories of those who were there. What I would like to do, though, for a little bit of time is to talk about the rising of faith renewed, because it has a bearing not only on what we do and say here on Sundays, and particularly this Sunday, but also on your future. But first of all, as always, let me thank you to the She Sings group, and to Paula and Jorge and Elaine, and for those of you that read poetry, and for everyone who has helped get this service ready. Today is Easter. It is the most important holy day in the Christian tradition. Were it not for Easter and the resurrection, Christianity would probably not exist. If it had just been Good Friday, as Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan say in this book, The Last Week, Christianity probably wouldn't exist if it was just about Good Friday and the crucifixion. Now, every year, Unitarian Universalists in general, and especially Unitarian Universalist ministers, try to come up with new ways to talk about Easter. After all, many of us do not believe in the resurrection narrative. So, in the last couple of generations, we've tried to rename or reframe Easter as a metaphor for renewal, spring, new beginnings, and so on. And that's fine. It all works, because after all, Easter is deeply tied in to its pre-Christian roots of the beginning of spring. So the readings of poetry that we had, and the music, and the flower celebration that we'll do a little bit later, speak also to the varying themes of Easter and spring and renewal, and, if you will, resurrection. However, we have become very good in the last several generations, we Unitarian Universalists, at tiptoeing around an elephant in the living room, or shall we say the sanctuary. There is a big elephant, and it's called, what do we do about Easter in its traditional sense? Because I can guarantee you, and you know this as well as I, that the other churches around us in this area, and in most parts of North America, and the Western Hemisphere, and also somewhat in Europe, are all celebrating Easter the normal way. What do we do then, or do we miss out an important expression of faith, not belief, but faith, if we do not accept the traditional Easter story? That's my question. I want to look at several sub-questions to that question, because maybe, just maybe, we can revisit the Easter story and find even just a bit of common ground with our more traditional sisters and brothers who are at other churches today. Here are the questions. Is the Easter story of Jesus' resurrection factual? 2. If not, is there another way to interpret the story that would satisfy our rationality but still make it meaningful? 3. Could we possibly celebrate Easter as our Christian, Unitarian, and Universalist did, but with a new story of faith? Now, let's talk a bit about faith. Because faith is a very powerful and sometimes very misunderstood word. Usually, if you look it up in a dictionary, the word faith means a belief in God here in the West. Or it means that you believe in the doctrines that a religious community gives you as a gift, and you're supposed to obey them. That's faith. Here's another definition of faith. a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. A firm belief in something for which there is no proof. Now, we might look at the word faith and say, as Unitarians did for generations, the progress of human beings to wisdom and enlightenment. We're going to get better. That's the art. That's the process of being human. And that was our Unitarian faith. Our Universalist faith was that all would be redeemed. All were saved. No one was doomed to hell. And that was what our Universalist ancestors believed. Neither statement could be proven. We don't know if people are going to get better, and we don't know if there's such a thing as universal salvation. But people had faith that it would happen, even if there was no proof. So that's some definition of faith. I'm going to mention one a little bit later. So let's go to those questions about Easter. Was Jesus' resurrection factual? Did it really happen? To someone who's Christian and believes in the literal, inerrant words of the Bible as the Word of God, yes, it is absolute fact. It says so. It is the Word of the divine. It therefore happened. That's belief. People believe it, and it must be so. Now, non-Christians and many who do not believe in the miracle of the resurrection would say, no, the story's not true. Now, one example of that was our more or less religious ancestor, Thomas Jefferson. He got a little distressed at some of the wording in the New Testament. And so what he did in a very low-tech way was to cut and paste the entire document, taking out anything that seemed supernatural or was avoiding the law of nature. So what he did at the end of his, what's called Jefferson Bible, was the stone was rolled in front of the tomb. Period. The end. And that was it. It's very simple. Because his opinion was anything that didn't abide with natural law was probably false. And so people don't rise from the dead, so therefore the story came to an end. And more importantly, he was looking at what are the teachings of Jesus than the story of what happens afterwards. So those are two extremes. One being it's absolutely true, and the other is it can't be true because it doesn't abide with nature. In between are most Christians who accept as a matter of faith that something quite wonderful happened, but we really don't know what it was. But that's faith. Now, in their book that I mentioned earlier, Marcus Borg and John Crossan, in the book of last week, ponder the question of the resurrection's truth. Now, many of you have heard of them. They're both very liberal Christian scholars. They speak widely together and singularly. And you probably remember that they were at Anderson University, actually at a Baptist church, where Marcus Borg said, I never thought I'd be at a Baptist church that was filled to overflowing. He was quite amazed. What they argue in this book, The Last Week of Jesus, is that those who believe in the resurrection story have two choices. First choice, it's absolute fact. Okay, that's one. Or, and this is what they argue, is instead of being looked at as absolute fact, it must have happened, that it's a parable. The importance, they say, of this story is the meaning of it, rather than the question, did it happen? Could you have videotaped it? Would there have been reporters there? Would it actually have happened exactly the way the document says it did? They say what's most important is the meaning. So they give this example. You all, or most of you, are familiar, I'm sure, with the parable of the Good Samaritan. It doesn't mean that we have to believe that Jesus of Nazareth actually experienced or saw a Good Samaritan, who, by the way, was an unholy sinner in the Jewish purity laws, actually stopped to help somebody injured on the road after a priest and a Levite had to walk by because of their own holy laws, their own purity laws. They couldn't touch the injured man because they'd become impure. It doesn't mean that Jesus actually saw that happen. What he was doing was sharing a story, and a story with very powerful meaning. It might have happened, but it doesn't matter. What matters is the meaning of the story. And I listen to some of you coming in every single week into my office, where we have usually tea and chocolate if the opportunity is there. And I hear the most amazing stories. I don't go on the presumption they're all true. But even if they weren't, they have great meaning. It's wonderful. Now, one of the things that Dr. Borg and Dr. Crossan mentioned, and Karen Armstrong has said this too in her books, it's only been since the Enlightenment in the 17th century that Westerners, us, have equated the word factual with truth. If something is true, it has to be able to have been proven to have been a fact. It actually has to have happened. Prior to that time, people quite liberally, if you can use the pun, believed that just because something might or might not have been true, it actually probably did happen. And here's an example from Buddhist teachings. There are many sutras or teachings that the Buddha is attributed to the teachings of the Buddha. But the likelihood, and scholars know this, is that at least half of them he never said. But during that era, and we have some of that even now, it was, well, the Buddha probably didn't say this, but if he had said it, this was what he would have said. It is a leap of faith. It is logic that's not very well balanced. It's not very well anchored. But the meaning is, well, if he'd known about this, he probably would have said this. And you can see where we can go with this. But truth and fact weren't tied together as they are for us. So let's suppose that the resurrection story isn't factual for us. What meaning could it have? Well, one meaning could be that Jesus died for our sins and was raised as the manifestation of God. That probably doesn't appeal to most of us. Okay. Another meaning from Dr. Borg and Dr. Crossan is another one we could probably agree to. They say that the Easter resurrection is a metaphor for the Roman Empire and secular authority being no match for the compassion of God and the teachings of Jesus. The empire could kill whoever it wanted, but the teachings of love and compassion would always win. The teachings of Jesus about caring for your neighbor and nonviolent resistance to tyranny would outweigh all the violence that an imperial entity such as the empire could ever push to you. Now, we religious liberals might agree with that. The oppressed, the marginalized, those who have been trampled by business as usual, or even business, cannot be killed or placed in a tomb and hidden away. They will come again. They will be renewed. So that's two meanings. Here's the third. The metaphor of the empty tomb in Jesus' resurrection is a story of isolation and despair transformed into new life. I want you to take a leap of faith here for a moment from your own lives. Imagine you're in a pitch black cave with no way out, no light, no idea of any future that's meaningful. You've had a rotten time. Things look grim. You are filled with despair. Suddenly, the stone in front of that tomb, the cave, is rolled aside, and you're invited to step back out into the world of life and light. How many of you here, along with me, have been in that dark tomb from time to time? How many of you have been isolated by addiction or a terrible job or a relationship that somehow has become strange or an academic career that makes no sense and seems like a blind alley? How often have you been in deep sorrow, despair, and not known any way out? And then somehow, because of the intervention or kindness or compassion or love of someone else, the doorway opens and you find your way back out. How many of us have been there and found our way out because of prayer or the insight or words of caring friends? Because finding your way out of the tomb of despair depends on community. That's one reason we do Joys and Sorrows here. The tomb is when we're isolated and alone. The stone rolled away takes others. So the story of Jesus and resurrection is belief and faith, but maybe in a whole different way than some people imagine it to be. I talked about faith earlier as a firm belief in something for which there's no proof. Here's another definition. Buddhist teacher Ken MacLeod writes this about belief and faith, and I heard him say this once. He said, belief is what everyone believes to be true because everybody says it. And it can't be changed because we know it's true because everybody says it. Closed system. Then he says, faith is being open to the possibility of not knowing and making a place in our life for the mystery, for new ideas and approaches that we do not know what they are. So belief, unchangeable. Faith, new possibilities. So let's suppose that our families and friends and neighbors who go to Christian churches this morning with a powerful belief in the risen Christ who was killed and resurrected. That's their faith. It might be some of yours too, and that's fine. But our faith might be that we simply don't know what happened 2,000 years ago, but that it carries huge meaning for us, no matter what we call our religious system. Our faith in the mystery of the empty tomb and the power of Jesus' teachings might say these things to us. We have faith that Jesus' teachings, like the Beatitudes, are great truths. And on that Easter morning and every Easter since then, come back to life. We have faith that the marginalized and the poor and the persecuted and the powerless cannot be thrown aside, but are all equally worthy of the gifts of life. Jesus' teachings come to this day in the great teachers, including this one, Martin Luther King, who wrote or said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Justice for all and not just a few." That's faith. So faith is the meaning of the empty tomb could mean so many things, and not just one doctrine that says it has to be this way. Because Jesus' teachings arose from his death and take new shapes for every generation, including this one. So let me end with one more thought before we do a shortened together time for children. I was touched when Nate came up earlier, and also, of course, Paula mentioned about Terry. Here's another idea about Easter belief and faith and coming out of that dark cave. I arrived here about 2 years ago, and I remember hearing from a number of people here a belief that things were pretty bad. There was a belief that you didn't know how you're going to get on your feet again. you had a belief that, well, you weren't too good. That was belief. Now, you and I and some other people have rolled the stone aside, and you've entered back into the daylight of possibilities. And that is faith. And so next Sunday and the following week, you're going to welcome Reverend Terry Bailoff here as your candidate for settled ministry. And you and she are going to figure out ways to continue that renewal, that resurrection, that rebirth into shared ministry that you started now 14 years ago with Cynthia. More importantly, you and she are going to prepare to walk away from that tomb where you found yourselves, and you're going to go back into your mission and your joy and the world that you helped create. The belief was that you'd never make it back out. But the faith is that you're not only back out, but you're ready to go. Now that's my faith in the future. So what I'll leave you with this morning, for when I come back in a couple of weeks, is that your faith too? We'll find out. Thanks.